The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation. We're a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. And each week we discuss trending topics and industry best practices. This week we are thrilled to have back with us Chris Wubbolt. Chris is the principal of QACV Consulting, and he's here this week to talk to us about managing data integrity expectations in good clinical practice environments. So thank you so much, Chris, for taking some time out to join us once again.
Thank you, Stacey. It's always a pleasure, and looking forward to the various topics that we speak about on these podcasts.
Likewise. Thank you. So this week we're talking about good clinical practice guidelines. Obviously in a regulated industry, you expect certain guidances that apply in any environment. Today, we're talking about clinical settings, defining standards for conducting clinical trials safely and ethically. So I know many regulatory agencies, have issued guidelines specific to good clinical practice. So can you just review current guidelines as they apply to data integrity for our audience?
Sure. There's actually quite a few guidances that are out there from regulatory agencies related to GCP and data integrity types of expectations. And I'll mention just a few of them. I know there are others that are out there also, but
sure.
There's ICH E6R2. That was the original ICH E6 guidance for clinical practice, guideline for clinical practice. Came out in 1995, and it was updated back in 2016. And there's actually an R3 version coming out soon, too, from what I understand, based upon a FDA and MHRA GCP symposium that I attended recently. And but ICH E6R2, when it was updated, actually has quite a bit of information related to computerized systems, the use of computerized systems, and data integrity expectations around those systems. So they talk about the requirements for validation, backup and restore processes, the SOPs that are needed, and so forth. Again, that's a more recent guidance that came out in 2016. I'm sorry. Okay. And there's also the MHRA has a GCP guide or a data integrity guidance that discusses some requirements and expectations for data integrity. That's actually applicable to both to GMP, GCP, and GLP. That's a GXP type of regulation or a guidance document. So that has quite a bit of information related to expectations around ALCOA principles and so forth.
Right.
The FDA published a guidance. It's a draft guidance still. It came out a couple of years ago. And it's a Q&A on Part 11 types of requirements and practices. Part 11, it came out in 1997. It is a data integrity regulation. Mm-hmm. The first control for closed systems, 1110A in Part 11, talks about the ability to discern invalid or altered records. That's data integrity. So the FDA has again, it's not a perfect guidance. It's still a draft, but there are definitely some issues with the guidance that I think will be updated before it becomes final. But it does have quite a bit of information around expectations around data integrity in a GCP environment. Back in 2007, the FDA also published a guidance called Computerized Systems Used in Clinical Investigations. That's version 2 of that guidance. Version 1 came out, I believe, in 1999, and that has a lot of information around the use of computerized systems to ensure some of the data integrity practices and so forth. So there's quite a bit of information in these guidances, and And it's worthwhile for everyone that's involved in our industry on the GCP side to actually be aware of those expectations, because regulators are definitely focusing on data integrity in all aspects of GXPs, but also in the GCP area.
Excellent, Chris. So, we can grab links to these particular guidances and include them in the show notes. That way, listeners have the opportunity to go ahead and take a look at them, make sure that they understand what current guidances are out there and what the expectations are. So in terms of good clinical practice data integrity, there are several items which might be of concern in a clinical setting. Comprehensive documentation for clinical protocols, record keeping, training, facilities, including computers and software. Which areas do you see as the most important for data integrity issues?
Well, I think that that it's important to ensure that the systems that are being set up are being created and built and established and verified appropriately for the intended use of the system. So for a typical GCP system, so eClinical system, so you have, I'll use electronic data capture, or an IRT system, which is interactive response technology system that might be used for drug supply purposes and also randomization. So these applications are developed by software vendors, and they're typically validated by sponsors or CROs that may use those applications. But then for each particular study, based upon the clinical protocol requirements, those systems are set up and built. Those studies are built up within those validated applications to ensure that they meet the protocol requirements. So one thing that I think is important to really ensure is that first you have the appropriate validation for that platform, that I'll call it, that core application that is being developed by software vendors, but then also that those studies that have specific protocol requirements, that they're being built to ensure that the protocol requirements are being achieved and met. There are some really important things to consider also in relation to some of these systems. So, for example, an IRT system, which again is used for randomization, it's really important to ensure that that there's no unblinding of a study, for example. So there are different treatment arms and branches, and if those studies are not set up correctly or configured correctly, then it's possible that someone may receive a notification from the software that has unblinding information. It might be a blinded clinician or someone at the sponsor company or a CRO and so forth. So I would say verify. One of the key aspects is, and there are many actually, one of the key aspects is verifying that the actual requirements for the clinical study have been verified, and that they're tested and validated to ensure that the protocol requirements are being met. That's normally a combination of the core platform validation and also what I call the study build and the UAT process, the user acceptance testing process for the actual studies that are built on those core platforms. Other aspects to consider are with clinical environments that there's a lot of interfaces between different systems. You have ePro systems, so that's electronic patient reported outcomes. You have interfacing with EDC systems. You have EDC systems interfacing with IRT systems, and data being uploaded from laboratories and things like that. So there are many, many areas that need to be considered and controlled, and we need all these interfaces and controls in place, but we need to make sure that they're working properly. So that's, I think, those are some of the areas that I think are most important from a data integrity perspective.
For sure, definitely very important when you're running a clinical study. I'm wondering about the importance. So you're talking about a lot of data, a lot of it being uploaded, so they are electronic records. But we hear a lot about the importance of raw data or true or original records, source data. Can you talk about why it's so important to have these original documents for investigators, and what does that actually look like?
Well, I'll go back to the traditional source data that's collected at clinical sites that maybe it's paper.
Right.
So if you have paper records and that's used to document the patient or subject visits at the clinical site, and then that information then is entered into an EDC system, and that EDC system at that clinical site, then that's actually then monitored by the CRAs or the monitors that are involved in visiting the sites and making sure that that source data is actually entered correctly and that the data in the EDC system are reflective of the source documentation. So in that situation, that the data from the site, that actual source data, that by itself is it's critical. Without that, you don't have a clinical study. But the data that's actually being used for data analysis and statistical analysis to indicate if the investigational product is effective or safe, efficacious or safe, that comes from the EDC system. So there has to be a verification process between the data in the EDC system versus the data that is being collected at the site, the source data. And if you're only looking at that data that's being extracted from the EDC system, that may or may not be reflective of the data that's actually collected at the site. So it's important for it's a sponsor responsibility actually to verify the correctness of the source data. It's the PI responsibility, the principal investigator responsibility, to ensure that that source data and the data in the EDC system is accurate and correct. And then regulators, when they do inspections, they typically will go to high enrolling sites or key clinical sites to do their inspections. And the purpose of it is to verify that the source data is correct. So it's important to ensure that you have maintain the source data. When that data is electronic, so there are sometimes e-source systems that are used. That's different than an EDC system, but electronic source data, where the data is never recorded on paper at the site, but it's recorded directly into an e-source system. Mm-hmm. And that also is very important. And so that has to be data that's collected contemporaneously. And again, that's one of the differences with an EDC system. The EDC system, the data is saved typically when you hit that save or submit button many times.
Right.
Or when you go from one page to another. With an e-source system, the data should be saved every time you leave a data field from that system to collect data, because that's contemporaneous data. That's how you would document the data if it was on paper. With a true copy so you need to have a true copy of the original record for electronic systems, because if that original record is destroyed or there's a crash of some type, you need to have a true copy of the original record. And it's important to really define what the original record is so that it has all the metadata, including audit trail information, so that when you make a true copy, you're not just collecting that final data that might have been sent to the EDC system or that might have been used in data analysis, but the data that's actually been collected and how it was transformed as well, and that audit trail, that metadata, so that you can, the purpose of all the data that we collect and all the documentation is to reconstruct the conduct of a study. If data changes are made that are not reflected in an audit trail, if you don't do a backup of that audit trail as part of the original and true copy of that record, then you don't have you're not able to fully reconstruct the conduct of that clinical study. So it's source data, source documentation, and that's a key aspect of data integrity and Alcoa principles. So if you don't have the source data or a true copy of it, then you may not have a clinical study that you can submit to a regulatory agency for approval.
Sure, and that makes sense. Have you seen this where clinical trials get just shut down because they have missed this somehow? This source data step? Yeah.
I have seen it actually, where there has been discrepancies, and this is in one of the companies I worked with before I started consulting when I was in industry. Again, I always say I'm still in the industry, but instead of working for one company, I work for 30 companies.
Right.
But we actually had, in one company I worked at, we had two databases for clinical data, and the databases. I don't know why they had the clinical teams collected two databases, but they were not able to reconcile the data within the two databases. It actually held up a submission to regulatory agencies, and this is in the 90s, before all the data integrity guidances came out and so forth. But
Right.
It actually held up a regulatory submission to the FDA for several months, and that company that I worked with was not able to submit that application before one of their competitors was able to submit a similar application for a similar product.
Right.
So it cost them.
So it can be detrimental to an organization if they are not following, this protocol.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. Data integrity is a key aspect of any type of GCP or GXP compliance. And so making sure that you have the controls in place, the source data that's available, you need to make sure that that's established, because if you don't, then you really shouldn't be in this industry.
Sure. Fair. So, and we talked a lot about the source data, but regulators are looking for, they're looking at not just whether you have the source data or original record, but they're really expecting that your internal processes and standards as an organization are in place so that making sure that things like backing up your source data, et cetera, happen as part of your standard operating procedure. Am I correct?
Yeah, you need to have your internal processes and procedures defined within your SOPs.
Right. And so, and in my experience has been, that's really what regulators are looking for from, at the top level, is if someone has all of these checks and balances in place, I guess you would assume that it's not that they don't still do their due diligence and do the audit, but you feel more comfortable that things are likely in order when the SOPs are clean. So, and hopefully I'm saying that correctly. But
yeah.
I wanted to talk about building all of these processes into your SOPs, and I wanted to get your feedback on exactly what should these SOPs entail and specific strategies for our listeners that are more universal in a clinical setting. Like, I get that you're going to have things that are specific to you as a company, but are there some things that are, just must-haves in any clinical setting?
So are you talking about SOPs at the sponsor level or processes at clinical sites?
I guess, both. I'm thinking about data integrity risks and how to avoid them by building them into your SOPs. And I guess it could be at the clinical site, but it could also be, as you're bringing it back into the organization for manufacture or production.
Okay. Well, let me start out at the sponsor level. So sponsors and pharmaceutical or companies that are conducting clinical research, they need to have procedures that define what their processes are. ICH E6R2, which I mentioned at the beginning of this session, actually has a pretty general requirement relating to quality assurance and quality control. It says that the sponsor has the responsibility to ensure that quality assurance and quality control procedures are established for the clinical study. So whatever that might be, you need to ensure that there are procedures available that define what those QA and QC practices are. Some of that could be related to monitoring, for example. And so monitors, when they go to the clinical sites, they need to verify the accuracy of the source data versus what's in the EDC system, for example. So that should be incorporated into your procedures. Monitors many times have checklists that they use to verify information that they follow when they conduct their monitoring visits. And you need to make sure that your procedures govern not only the traditional information that and topics that monitors cover, but also that they're assessing the integrity of the controls that the site may have in place for data that's being collected. It's not only data that's being entered into an EDC system, but there could be ECGs that are being collected that are being sent electronically to a core laboratory, or there might be other devices that are used to measure information that is maintained electronically. There could be electronic health record systems that are being used to enter source data instead of recording it on paper at some of the larger clinical facilities and institutions. So ensuring that your sponsor's SOPs have the right information related to data integrity so that those controls are being checked at the clinical sites. And there could be hundreds of clinical sites for one study, for one large phase 3 study, and maybe thousands in some cases. And so it's important to make sure that the appropriate procedures are in place, and those people that are conducting those monitoring visits are trained and have that knowledge of what to look for. They may not be experts in data integrity or in e-systems, for example, or how data is collected electronically, but if they find potential issues, they need to be aware of that, incorporate that into their monitoring reports, and then make sure that the sponsor or the CRO takes the appropriate actions to maybe do follow-up investigations and so forth. I've actually done due diligence or for-cause audits of clinical sites because of the exact same situation where a clinical site, there are some data discrepancies are identified by a core laboratory. Mm-hmm. And they notified the sponsor. The sponsor asked me to go to the site to do a for-cause audit, and found data integrity issues that were at the site because of lack of controls that were implemented at the site. So I think it's important to, and that's one example of an SOP, to make sure that monitors know the right questions to ask, and then to relay that information to the appropriate people or groups within their organization. There's also every SOP that is really being developed or used. Most SOPs are for processes that may include collection of data and things like that. Those SOPs should be reflective, should ensure that there's appropriate reviews of that data by the appropriate personnel, either supervisors or QA or QC personnel and so forth. Sometimes I've actually seen in some examples when I've done internal audits of organizations where there's an SOP that required certain data to be collected as part of a process. And the form that was used to record that data on paper, not even electronic, it didn't include all the information that was required by the SOP to be collected. So someone could be filling out a form completely and still not meeting the requirements of the SOP in terms of all the data that's collected because the form didn't reflect what the requirements of the SOP. So to me, GCP or data integrity is really much broader than what most people look at it, consider it. And every aspect of what we do in a GCP environment, GXP, GMP, GLP, is really based upon the data and the controls that are associated with that. And so data integrity is really one of the key cornerstones or fundamentals of GCP compliance, and it needs to be reflected in almost every SOP because that's used at the sponsor level, and then at the clinical site level. Again, those controls at the clinical sites may need to be assessed and evaluated, and that should be part of the sponsor SOPs as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And I'm just wondering, so we're talking a lot about electronic records, whether they started out electronic or whether they were entered and became electronic records. And I'm just wondering how, obviously, you're backing this up into the cloud or having some way of backing up all of your data because it's important that you have all of that original data. And I'm just wondering about electronic copies. Can they be used as accurate reproductions of electronic records, or are there specific exceptions to this? And talk about that and e-signatures. What are the specific expectations, I guess, from regulators around those kinds of things?
Yeah, well, definitely electronic copies can be used to support submissions, but the key is, are they true copies or ICH 6 calls them certified copies of electronic records. So are they true copies, or are they missing key elements of metadata or audit trails and so forth, so you can make a copy of the record, but if it's not a true copy or a certified copy, it may not be valid. It has no integrity at that point. So it's important. You can use electronic copies, but you have to verify that those copies are certified copies of the original record, so that there's nothing missing, metadata, audit trails, as I mentioned, that would allow the context of those records to be misused or misconstrued. With regard to electronic signatures, there's Part 11, which discusses electronic signature requirements, and there's a lot of information in Subpart C of Part 11 with regard to electronic signatures. But I think the key is having controls in place to ensure the attributability of whoever is using electronic signature, that they are actually the person that entered that electronic signature. What are the controls in place for that? If you have a check and you sign my name to the check, that's not acceptable. That's considered fraud.
Fraud, right.
And forgery. And it's the same type of concept with electronic signatures. How do you ensure that those controls that are established to allow someone to electronically sign their name to a record, a GCP record of some type of report or protocol or a plan, and how do you ensure? What are the controls in place to ensure that person actually signed it, that someone else didn't sign for them, for example. And for handwritten signatures, there's a lot of controls in place of forensic experts that can tell if it's a forgery or not. Mm-hmm. And so you can't really do that with a electronic signature if someone shares a password, but there are procedures and policies and training and other controls that can be established to ensure that electronic signatures are used only by those people that are actually truly signing their name electronically.
Okay, understood. So obviously all of this is part of what a regulator might be looking at if they're coming in to do an audit, and they're just looking for not only the copies of the data, but to make sure that the source data and the metadata and all of that is behind it, so that they can follow the trail, correct?
Yeah, that's what they're looking for. And they're really, again, the data that's being collected at clinical sites that goes through, it could start off as paper. It could go to a CRO. It could go to a laboratory. It could go back to to another CRO. And there's a lot of there's SAS extracts that have SAS data sets. There's a lot of transformations of that data that could occur before it finally gets included into a clinical study report and a submission. And regulators really need to understand that data flow and how that data is being transformed, what the controls are in place for that, and be able to trace that back to the original data, that original source data that was collected at the clinical site.
Right, and I understand that, and the standard operating procedures are important in making sure that everything the flow is set up correctly, and that everybody who's working on any part of the clinical study understands what needs to happen. But even with the best SOPs and controls in place and trained staff, there's always that human error factor. Things can still go wrong. What, in your experience, are the most typical findings or citations when regulators do come in to do an audit? And can you give us some examples based on actual audits that you've been involved in?
Yeah, sure. A lot of it comes down to lack of knowledge or information on the actual technologies that are in place and the controls for those technologies. I have so many examples of this because I do a lot of audits, both internal audits, vendor audits, site audits, and so forth. But so I did an internal audit for a company in California. It was my last trip before the lockdown, actually.
Right.
And I evaluated, it was a large company, and they have really smart people in place and people that are dedicated and strive to do the best they can and be comprehensive. And but I looked at actual configuration of security profiles within an application that this company was using, and there were so they had a process to assign security profiles to each of their users. They have thousands of users. but that's a procedural process. It's not adding a user to a group, for example. And so when I reviewed that, there were actually, I believe, pretty many. It was about 40 or 50, maybe more users that were assigned the incorrect security profile for their use. So they weren't set up with the right security profile. That security profile did not include the requirement for things like strong passwords and things like that. So it was actually a lack of knowledge or understanding of the technology and what could go wrong. The FDA does have a data integrity guidance document, but it's for GMP. Mm-hmm. And within that guidance document, the FDA states that you need to do risk assessments, but that should be based upon the business models and understanding of the technical aspects of those business models. So what I've seen many times, again, most organizations, they do the best they can, and the issues that occur are when there's information that they are not aware of because they haven't really researched it as carefully as they should have, or they don't understand maybe some of the vendor controls that are established, possibly some of the technical controls, and they really do the best they can, but it's lack of knowledge and understanding of, and that's really the basis for any risk assessment, the knowledge and understanding of the potential risks associated with the use of business models or software or other technical equipment or instrumentation and so forth. So that's where I see where most of the issues occurred that I've seen. Once I did an audit, it was a for-cause audit where the software actually, there was a delay, a slowness of the application, and it was slower than normal in some cases, mm-hmm. and it turned out that caused a delay in an audit trail being published or populated with electronic signatures and so forth. So that was because the vendor didn't know that the slowness of the software could cause this issue until I brought it up during an audit, and they identified that it could cause a delay of up to 2 days, maybe, in the publishing or the creation of an audit trail entry. So again, I think most companies try to do the best they can, and sure. The people in those companies are trained, they're highly qualified, and in most cases. But then it's just that information, that lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, the getting down to that deeper level of understanding to really do the best job they can in terms of identifying risks and then taking steps to mitigate those risks.
Wow. So, I mean, and we hear a lot about that knowledge management and just understanding, especially when you have multiple people working on a particular piece of the job, right? So each one, it's not important for one person to understand it, but everybody needs to understand it. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, I think everyone has responsibilities that has to be clearly defined, and again, that's one of the reasons why it's important to have these independent organizations, QA groups within your organization, to go through and periodically do audits of these processes and the controls that are in place, because people can do the best job they can and think they're doing everything correctly, but there can still be problems. So it's always good to, as part of your data integrity program, your governance program, to have monitoring by independent organizations such as your QA group, to go in and really have a new set of eyes that look at these processes, challenge what's actually being done. And I'm not saying challenge in a negative way. For me, when I do an audit, I always say that I'm here to, I equate whatever I'm auditing, the quality system or the data integrity program, I look at it as like a barn door, and I try to do the best I can to see if I can break that barn door open in a nice and constructive way, of course. Right. But then if that barn door bends a little bit and is able to bounce back, then that means you have a pretty robust process. And I'll dig deep. I dig. People that have seen the audit know that I dig pretty deeply. If that barn door bounces back, that's great. That's what you want to happen. You want it to be challenged. But if that barn door breaks open and people are not aware of maybe technical issues or other things that might have been identified, then that means that there have to be fixes, and there's an issue, potential data integrity issues that could cause patient safety issues and other issues and so forth also. And it really is truly a patient safety issue. I remember one audit that I did, and I identified that it was an eClinical vendor, mm-hmm. and I identified that there was notifications that were not verified or validated appropriately from I think it was an IRT system possibly. And so what happened was the software platform was validated, but the study wasn't, the requirements of the study were not verified or validated through appropriately or adequately for a UAT process. So in that situation, I looked at some of the records, and there was actually a patient that reported in their, it might have been an ePro system, electronic patient reported outcome system, that recorded that they took in one day 12 tablets or 12 doses of the investigational product, and the next day 18 doses. So that was reported in the ePro system. Notifications were not sent to the appropriate people because that's, first of all, that's not following the protocols. But the most important thing is that could have been an overdose. That wasn't, to me, that's an adverse event.
Right.
That could have been an overdose of that patient taking the investigational product, and no one knew about it until that audit because the application, the study wasn't set up and built appropriately to verify that notifications were being sent out to the correct people when things like that occurred. So that's definitely patient safety related to an eClinical system and the verification and validation of that system, and it's related to data. It's all related to data integrity. So it's so important to make sure that the appropriate controls in place and that you challenge those controls. Again, I always have to put the caveat. Some people can come in and do audits and they bulldoze their way through things. Sometimes that's needed, but the purpose of an audit is to constructively identify potential risks and liabilities and issues or gaps that may impact studies, to impact the integrity of the study, or potentially have patient safety considerations or concerns. So
such an important process for these companies to go through, whether internal audits or having someone like yourself come in from the outside and really help them see what they might be missing, right? And work on it sooner rather than later, work on a fix or whatever, remediate any issues sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and it's better to do it now than after someone gets sick or dies from an issue or a submission is held up and so forth. So the earlier that you can identify potential issues, the better. And it truly is a partnership. Sponsors are working with CROs and vendors so that they can all be successful in getting drugs to market and successful regulatory submissions. And the audits are really they're not punitive, or they shouldn't be. But they're really to ensure that those partners are working together to make sure that submission, those new treatments and therapies are approved and helping patients and that are taking those new treatments and so forth.
Right. Absolutely. Well, some great information, Chris, for our listeners, and great understanding of the good clinical practice, the expectations, and where some of the pitfalls are. So I appreciate that. Before we wrap up for the day, I wanted to see if you had any last minute tactics or strategies that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Yeah, the key to all this, to being successful, is knowledge and information and digging deep and challenging and working collaboratively and constructively with your partners, either within an organization, at clinical sites, at vendors that you're working with, at CROs, and really understanding the what can go wrong, and then taking steps to prevent those issues from occurring, to jeopardize your clinical studies or possibly jeopardize the patient's health and safety.
Well said. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. I really appreciate you taking some time to be here with us again today. It's great to have you as always. I want to give a big thank you to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe for their support. And I also want to give a big shout out to you, our valued listeners. So if you like Voices in Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share it with your colleagues and online networks. We appreciate that too. So for more information on the podcast and links from today's show notes, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We are looking forward to being back with you again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.